Okay, we are going to read a new book called Kildee House. Okay, and I don't want to read the back because I don't want to give it away. So we're going to start with Kildee House. We're supposed to read chapters 1 to 4. We'll see. We may have to take a little break. I probably will just read one chapter at a time, and we'll do that throughout the day because I think the chapters are a little long. Jerome Kildee had built himself a house on the mountainside. It was an odd house because Jerome Kildee was an odd man. He built his house under a giant redwood tree on Windy Point. Since the days of Julius Caesar, creatures had been building homes at the foot of the redwood or in its branches. At the time Jerome built his house, most folks did not build on knobs high on a mountainside, even the round-topped wooded mountains of the Pacific Coast Range. What the neighbors said or what they thought was of no concern to Jerome. The day he walked out on Windy Point and looked up at the giant redwood towering into the sky and stood savoring the deep silence, he knew he was going to stay. When he turned from the giant tree and looked down over the green ridges, the smoky valley, into the gray-white haze of the Pacific, he smiled. This was a land of silence and the place for a silent man. The house Jerome built was not as wide as the redwood. To have made it so wide would have been a waste of space. There's a picture in the book of the house they have.
What's wrong with him building it where he is?
He's just saying it's not normally the place that they would build it. Yes. Yeah, it was for soap and various things she had gotten for me.
Okay.
Yeah. Most folks didn't build their houses where he was doing it. Okay, Hannah, please stop. The house Jerome built was not as wide as the redwood. To have made it so wide would have been a waste of space because Jerome did not need that much room. He toted the biggest window he could buy to the cabin and set it in the wall, which faced a panorama of ridges and valleys. Panorama is like a whole view of it.
So this is a man, not a kid?
This is a man who decided to build a house in an odd place. You see it? It's like built in onto the back of a tree.
That's weird.
Okay, it's built onto the back of the tree there. He toted the biggest window he could buy to the cabin and set it in the wall, which faced a panorama of ridges and valleys. Do you see that there? That's a whole window right there. Look at that.
That'd be nice.
That's a whole window right there. The window was as high as the wall. It was one wall as far across as the door. It had been rolled out as a plate glass window for a store. The back wall was the redwood trunk. It made an odd house. One wall curved inward and finished with shaggy redwood bark. Jerome rented a horse, and packed...
Yeah. Mom and Dad wanted me to tell you.
And packed Monterey stone up for a fireplace. The fireplace was a thing of beauty. It filled one end of the room. The cream Monterey stone, traced through with threads of red, was carefully fitted and matched for grain. The hearth was wide, and the mantel was inlaid with chips of abalone shell. It was the last piece of stonework Jerome planned to make, and he made it a masterpiece. In a recess back of the last slab of stone, he tucked away the tools of his trade and sealed them into the wall. Jerome Kildee, maker of fine monuments, was no more. There remained only Jerome Kildee, philosopher, a silent little man, seeking to become a part of a silent mountain. So he's going to stop building stonework and he's just going to live in this house and live a silent life. Jerome Kildee did not work. He owned the 100 acres of wood and hillside around him, but he did not clear any of it. He bought all of his food, and he had stove and fireplace wood hauled up and stacked outside his door. Jerome hired the Eppies to haul the wood to the bottom of the hill, then up the hill with their tractor because there was only a winding footpath up from his mailbox. The Eppies laughed and made quite a bit of it. Jerome had hundreds of cords of oak and madrona close to his cabin. The farmer and his sons would have cut it and sawed it for a tenth of what Jerome paid for the wood and the hauling. Jerome had no near neighbors, nor would he ever have any, because he had built in the exact center of his 100 acres. He had gone through life silent, unable to talk to people.
What does that have to do with being in the center, not being able to...
Well, if he owns 100 acres and he builds a house right in the middle,
It's going to be hard to walk.
Nobody-
50 acres.
well, not only that, nobody can live by him because he owns it. So the closest they could be is 50 acres on one side or the other.
So you'd have to walk 50 acres to see something.
Right. He didn't want to, okay, so now I got to back up. I got a little confused where I was. He had gone through life silent, unable to talk to people, expecting them to leave him to his own thoughts. He had never visited the Epi family after they hauled his wood, although they lived at the foot of his hill on the north side. They put him down as a queer one. The 9 Eppies, as they were known locally, were robust folks. The 6 sons were over 6 feet tall. Emma Lou would someday be almost as tall as her brothers. The Cabot place at the foot of the mountain on the other side of the hill was certainly not a place where Jerome would care to go. It was a fine estate with landscaped gardens and a swimming pool. The Cabots had one son, Donald Roger, who had never given Jerome more than a brief look. But Jerome Kildee found he was not without friends. He had a host of friends, and he didn't have to talk to them to keep their friendship. In fact, his silence helped to keep them friendly. They were all interested in him, a new experience for Jerome, and he was interested in them. Jerome found that they were not unlike the people back where he had operated his monument shop. They were willing to take advantage of him. They were selfish, and some of them were thieves, like the trade rats who packed off anything they could carry, regardless of whether or not they could use it. He soon learned that none of the raccoons could be trusted inside the cabin. They unscrewed the caps off ketchup bottles as easily as he could do it. They unlatched cupboard doors or opened them if there was a knob on them. One old raccoon, who was the neighborhood grouch, lived in a hole in the trunk of his redwood tree. Old Grouch had refused to move when Jerome built his house. He considered the redwood tree his tree. He made it clear to Jerome that he was trespassing. The pair of spotted skunks who set up housekeeping under his floor were folks of a different sort from the raccoons. They were not dull-witted stinkers of the sort Jerome had known in his boyhood, dumb fellows who for ages had been depending upon poison gas instead of their wits for protection. They carried guns but seldom used them. The little spotted skunks were as smart as the raccoons and about as curious. They had a real sense of humor and were always playing pranks on the raccoons. With them around, Jerome always had to get down on his hands and knees and explore the chimney of his fireplace before he built a fire. The skunks liked the fireplace and would gladly have traded it for their nest under the floor. They were not big stinkers like the swamp skunks, so Jerome could always fish them out of the chimney with his broom. Jerome would probably have been crowded out of his house by the assortment of mice that found his house and the fine bark wall of the redwood to their liking, if it had not been for the spotted skunks. The skunks had large appetites, so they kept the mouse population on an even keel. 2 big wood mice. They would eat the skunks. 2 big wood mice. Two big wood mice lived in a bark nest back of a knot in the tree trunk. They furnished dinners for the spotted skunks with a regularity which should have become monotonous. Monotonous means a little boring. How they could go on having big families, nursing them to a size to go out into the world, only to have them gobbled up one at a time as they left the nest, was more than Jerome could understand. There was another pair of mice who lived under his bed in a box of old letters, which they made good use of without snooping into the contents, or trying to figure out why Jerome had tied them in bundles. They chewed up all the letters except those written in indelible pencil. This removed from Jerome's life any desire to brood over the past. The spotted skunks could not get into the box. The mice went in through a knot hole in the end, but their families suffered the same fate as the wood mice, and they went on having big families. Jerome's wooded acres harbored many black-tailed deer and many gray fox and possums. The foxes never made friends, and the possums ignored him because he never kept chickens. They had no bump of curiosity to draw them to his house. He saw them often and had a nodding acquaintance with them, so to speak. The black-tails visited his garbage pit regularly. The does often brought their fawns into his yard, but they did not bother much with him because he did not grow a garden or set out young fruit trees. He was about like any other dweller on the wooded mountain. He just lived there. It was during the 2nd year that old Grouch turned the head of a dainty little miss. She was just 16 months old, and like many other lass before her, she fell in love with a good-for-nothing. Old Grouch brought her to his nest in the redwood. It was high up on the tree where a burl formed a deep pocket. Old Grouch had learned that a redwood tree was a safe haven. When coon dogs chased him, followed by yelling humans, all he had to do was shinny up that giant tree. The hunters could not shake him out or climb the tree. Of course, after Jerome came, the coon dogs and the hunters stayed away. Old Grouch brought his bride home in January during the heavy rains. In April, she presented him with a family. Like many another good-for-nothing, old Grouch failed to provide for his family. Though he did bring any of the food she rustled, though he did share the nest with them, taking the dry side and grabbing any of the food she rustled, which suited his taste. Jerome couldn't climb the tree to look into the nest, but he heard the babies and listened to the family chit-chat over them. Old Grouch mildly irritated Jerome. He was smug and fat and always ready to march into the cabin and demand part of Jerome's fried egg or lamb chop, but never thanking his host for anything and always staying outside unless there was food. Any friendly advance was always met with a snarl or a snapping of white fangs. He was a surly fellow, but Jerome admired the way he had with the ladies.
Oh, this reminds me of that mountain book that we
My Side of the Mountain. His wife was of a different sort. She was friendly and thankful to Jerome for bits of food he gave her. She visited the cabin while he was in it, and not just when it was mealtime. She would have taken over his larder if he had allowed it. Her willingness to shift old Grouch's responsibility for the family to him gave Jerome a problem. He was forced to invent new catches for his cupboard doors and to fashion latches for his pull drawers. Outwitting the slim little bride was no easy matter. With feminine wiles, she made up to Jerome, letting him stroke her head and scratch around her ears, smiling coyly up at him as he sat in his padded chair, but raiding his cupboard as sure as he went for a walk. Jerome fixed inside catches for the doors, worked by wires which went up through the inside of the cupboard and were pulled by strings dangling from the ceiling, well out of the reach of the raccoon. The pull drawers became pop-out drawers worked by wires with dangling strings attached to them. Jerome's house was well decorated with strings hanging from the ceiling. A large button dangled at the end of each string like a black spider. When Jerome wanted an egg for breakfast, he pulled a string and open popped a drawer, exposing the egg carton. Then Jerome always had to take out 2 eggs because the minute the door popped open, in popped Mrs. Grouch, and Jerome had to split 50-50 with her. He could have closed and barred the door, but then he would have had to sit by the big window eating his egg with Mrs. Grouch's furry bangs pressed against the plate glass, her bright eyes watching every bite he took, her little tongue dripping hungrily. The rains lasted a long time that spring, keeping until June. Mrs. Grouch stood the home her old man had provided for her as long as she could. The babies were growing and taking up more room. The roof leaked, and old Grouch always took to the dry side. When the wind blew from the north, there might as well have been no roof at all. One afternoon, while Jerome was trampling in the woods, snug in oilskins and rubber boots, she moved her babies into the house for cleaning. Helping herself to stuffing in his mattress, she made a nest in the oven. She had long ago learned how to open the door. The smell of the oven pleased her. It had a faint food smell, which was elegant. She could feed her babies and lick oven walls, nibbling bits of burned meat as she came to them. Jerome discovered the family at once because the oven door was open. He did not scold about the mattress when she showed him her brood of silky raccoons, but he was hungry, and this was Saturday afternoon. Jerome always fixed a beef roast for Saturday supper. Once a week, the mailman left the meat in the mailbox at the foot of the hill. Jerome got a wooden box and put it in a corner, and then he moved the family. Mrs. Grouch was miffed, but she accepted the change with a sly smile. Later, she would slip her family back into the oven. Old Grouch stamped up on the porch and seated himself in the open doorway. He scolded his wife in proper style. He glared at Jerome and tossed a few nasty cracks at him. Between growls, he kept sniffing the roast cooking in the oven and shaking his fur to get the raindrops off of it. With a final warning to his wife, he turned about, climbed the redwood trunk, and got into his nest. The wind was from the north, and his wife was not there to keep the rain off his back. He stayed in the nest for half an hour, then he climbed back down the tree trunk and walked to the door. Jerome grinned at him. He was cutting the roast. He sliced off a piece and laid it on a saucer. He set the saucer on the floor. Old Grouch looked at the saucer. This was dangerous business. Going into a cabin was like stepping into a box trap. But he was wet and cold, and his wife had walked out on him. He needed food and warmth. Ruffling his scruff, he walked into the house. He paused at the saucer and sniffed the good smell of the roast. He took a bite. When Mrs. Grouch scurried across the floor to share with him, he caught up the piece of meat in his forepaws. He sat up and glowered at her. Then he began munching on his roast. His wife sniffed eagerly. She looked up at Jerome. He handed her a slice of meat. She took it and seated herself beside her husband. They sat there eating very much like humans, using their small hands to tear bits of meat from the large pieces and then stuffing the bits into their mouth. By the time Jerome had finished his supper, old Grouch had made up his mind. He had marched to the door 3 times, and each time the cold rain had spattered into his face. He knew his wife and babies were going to sleep warm and dry inside the cabin. She had already returned to the box where she sat with her small black eyes just above the edge. Old Grouch felt he could do with some more roast, too. He was still a bit hungry. He would stay in the cabin. After the dishes were washed, Jerome lighted his pipe. He was faced with a new problem. He had been trying for weeks to get old Grouch into the cabin. Now that the old fellow and his family had moved in, he dared not close the door. If he closed the door, it was hard to say what old Grouch would do. Jerome was sure it would be pretty wild. But the night air was growing chilly. The wind was blowing into the room, wet and cold. Even if he did chase Old Grouch out into the rain, he couldn't put Mrs. Grouch and the babies out. Jerome got to his feet. Old Grouch took one look at Jerome towering above him, then scuttled into the night. Jerome set the gasoline mantle lamp on the table so the white light would flood the door. He got his tool chest from under the bed. Mrs. Grouch kept her eyes just above the edge of the box. Jerome cut a small door in the bottom of his big door. He swung the small door by a pair of butterfly hinges and bored 3 holes in it. As he gathered up his saw and auger and screwdriver, Jerome realized that the little door would offer welcome to any and all who roamed. It would mean keeping open house to all, except, of course, those neighbors too big to squeeze through the little door. He had never been able to make friends. It might be that little door would change everything. He took the lamp and examined the chimney of his fireplace. The little skunks were not sleeping on the damper, so he lighted the fire. He lighted the fire he had laid earlier in the day. Weren't. Pulling his padded chair up to the fireplace. It's a thing for the fireplace that you light. Dad could show you on our fireplace. I'm not exactly sure. Pulling his padded chair up to the fireplace, he set his tobacco jar on the chair arm. As an afterthought, he got a saucer and stacked a few squares of roast on it. He set the saucer on the floor beside the chair. Jerome puffed slowly on his pipe. He watched the red tongues of flame lick around the oak and madrona logs in the fireplace. The beating warmth made him feel drowsy. He was on his second pipe when Old Grouch solved the mystery of the little door. He had peeped in through the 3 holes and discovered that Jerome had turned out the gasoline lamp, and his wife was snug and dry in the box with the babies. He sniffed and caught the rich smell of roast beef. He was wet and cold. He eased through the little door just as his wife hopped from the box carrying one of the babies. She had her teeth set in the scruff. Shaking the water from his fur, he watched her put the youngster into the oven. He scowled at her, but he didn't make a sound. The warmth of the fireplace and the smell of the roast in the saucer drew him. He moved warily toward the fire. His experience with men had made him wary, but he was cold and he had an idea he could eat some more. Seating himself in the deep shadows near the chair, he stretched his snout toward the dish. He kept his eyes on Jerome. When Jerome did not move, Old Grouch eased forward and picked up a piece of meat. He sat up and began munching it. Mrs. Grouch had finished transferring her babies to the oven. She sat on the door for a while, watching the 2 males at the fireplace. Shaking her head, she turned her back upon them and curled up with her brood. Jerome had... Brood is your babies, like your family. Jerome had never been able to talk with people. He had always known he was missing a great deal, but he had never been able to say the weather was nice or that the weather was bad when people came into his shop. He set his pipe on the arm of the chair and tossed another log on the fire. Old Grouch ducked into a patch of deep shadow, but he came out again and got another piece of meat. The warmth of the fire was beating against his fur. He felt contented and happy. Jerome leaned back and spoke out loud. When he spoke, the sound of his voice startled even himself. Old Grouch, now gorged with roast and sleepy from the heat, toppled off the hearth and had to make quite an effort to right himself. Mrs. Grouch get himself back up. Like when our sheep,
he's like really fat.
When our sheep roll over and they can't get back up.
So he's probably really fat.
Yeah. Mrs. Grouch thrust her head out of the oven and stared at Jerome wildly. If it had not been for her baby, she would have fled into the night. When I came up here, I was licked, Jerome had said. It was as though a stranger had spoken to him. He heard his own voice so seldom. He felt called upon to answer the stranger. And were you licked? Old Grouch batted his eyes fearfully. He looked all around the room, but saw no human being except Jerome, whom he had ceased to consider a man because Jerome never shouted or whistled or talked at all. I've spent a lifetime carving cherubs and angels on tombstones. I've cut many a nice sentiment on a gravestone, but never was able to recite a single line before company. Jerome pointed his pipe stem toward the fire. It's a sad business dealing with sad people and not being able to say a word to comfort them, because he would just help people with their tombstones. Old Grouch braced himself and let his stomach ease down until he was resting comfortably. He had room for a bite or 2 more, and the fire was very nice. Jerome smiled down at him. Old Grouch looked like a small bandit with the black patches which circled his eyes and extended along his cheeks like black bands, making a perfect mask against the lighter color of his fur. He cocked his head. He was in a mellow mood. His stomach was full to bursting. His furry hide was warm. He felt like singing. He started off with a soft shoo. Then he went into a deeper note, the raccoon, a longer drawn tremulous ooh, not unlike the call of a screech owl, only softer and sweeter, much more mellow. Jerome's smile widened. He had never dared venture a note himself. In all of the hundreds of times he has sat alone in his pew in church, he had never dared open his mouth and sing. I have missed much, he said. Ooh, old Grouch sang, his head swaying sleepily. Here's just a picture they have in the book of raccoons. Or actually, those may be skunks.
Yeah, those are skunks.
I think those are skunks.
Yeah, definitely.
Ooh, old Grouch sang, his head swaying sleepily. From the oven door came an answering trill. Never had Mrs. Grouch heard her husband put so much tenderness, so much romance into his song. It touched her deeply, so deeply she closed her eyes and sang back to him. Jerome laid down his pipe. Turning to catch the high soprano from the oven, Jerome noticed that the little door...
The book is making it sound like the animals are people.
Yeah, they are. It's making the animals sound like they're people. You're right. Jerome noticed that the little door was bobbing back and forth. He fixed his attention upon it. A small head with black shoe-button eyes appeared. The head moved into the room, followed by a slim body. A moment later, another slim body moved through the door. What do you guys think it is based on the picture?
Skunks.
2 tall white plumes lifted. The little spotted skunks had come visiting. Papa waved his plume and stamped his feet, and Mama waved her plume and stamped her feet. Like a good host, Jerome arose from his chair. Instantly, the 2 little skunks vanished through the door. Jerome filled a saucer with canned milk and set it near the door. Then he went back to his chair before the fire. Almost at once, the little door opened and the skunks marched in. They sat down and began lapping eagerly. When Mrs. Grouch hopped off the oven door and started toward the saucer, Papa elevated his plume and stamped his 4 feet. He rushed at her, did a handstand, flipped his hind feet down again, then stamped some more. Mrs. Grouch knew what that meant, as did every other living...
Mommy, is Mrs. Grouch, are they raccoons?
Yeah. Mrs. Grouch knew what that meant, as did every other living thing in the woods. She hastily retreated to the oven door, and Papa went back to his milk. Jerome leaned back in his chair. Old Grouch was in full voice now. His woo was deep and bell-like. Jerome tried an experimental note himself. He was amazed at its quality. It was a baritone note with feeling and depth in it, but it sent Mrs. Grouch scrambling back into the oven. Papa and Mama left without waiting to stamp their feet. Only old Grouch was not startled at all. He just sat and swayed back and forth and sang. He seemed to have caught the fine flavor of Jerome's baritone. Here's a picture of the raccoons in the oven. Jerome tried a few more notes. Mrs. Grouch stayed in the oven. The spotted skunk stayed under the floor. Old Grouch picked up the last square of roast and ate it slowly. When he swallowed it, his stomach bulged bigger. He cocked an eye at Jerome. Jerome tried a few hymns he remembered. Old Grouch joined in. He had only one song, but it blended well with any hymn. After a bit, Jerome began to feel sleepy. He was sleepy and he was happy. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Old Grouch yawned. He ambled toward the oven door, and after 2 tries, he managed to hop up on the door. Easing into the oven, he curled up with his family. Jerome sighed deeply. Here among friends, he could talk about things he had always wanted to talk about, and he could sing when he felt like it. He got to his feet and took his flannel nightgown from its hook, and he smiled as he got ready for bed. That's the end of chapter 1, and I'm going to keep reading, and we'll read through chapter 4 by tomorrow.